Hello and welcome to your one-stop for vehicle repair, restoration, and everything automotive. This is Bird's Garage. So I have some fantastic news, and that is winter's finally ending around here and spring is starting to break. So it's almost time to start cruising in our 68 Montego project car again. But before we do that, I gotta fix some big problems I noticed driving the car around late last year. The first one is the front suspension. There was a really bad creaking sound, kind of like metal to metal in the passenger front side. So I don't know if that's a coil spring, isolator, ball joint, I'm really not sure. So right now I'm going to put the car up in the air, pop off the front tires, we're going to look around together, we're going to see what's going on. Hopefully it's something we can fix, not a lot of time or money, but we'll just have to see what happens. You never know with a 50-year-old car. Okay, so before I put the car up in the air, I moved it up and down, shook it side to side, pressed up and down on the bumper. I was trying to replicate that noise so maybe you could hear it too, but no chance in that. So a few bad things I noticed right off the bat, and that is, the first one is that this bushing for this coil isolator in the shaft, you can see it's all hard, and there's even a big space down here. So this is probably my metal-to-metal contact here that I was hearing in the car. Second bad thing is the ball joints were replaced before, but there's literally a big hole right here, and you can see the socket here of the end of the ball joint shaft, and I don't know what was there, if there was some sort of covering. There should be a Zerk fitting somewhere to grease this ball joint, and I don't see one. Maybe it was right there on a panel. I just don't know. So I think I'm going to go ahead and change the ball joints, probably change the control arm bushings. I'm going to have to take some of the car apart in order to look at them, and then I'm definitely going to change these coil isolators. So before I can move this coil isolator, I have to remove the spring. But even before I can do that, I have to remove the shock absorber. So I'm going to start here at the bottom. There's a nut here and a nut on the other side, and then I gotta go up at the top and take the one nut out of the shaft, and then there's a bracket where the shaft goes through. I gotta take that out as well, and then go down in the center with a tool and compress this spring. Now I have the tool that you need to compress this spring. You always want to use the tool and think of safety first. Don't try to make a tool, don't put a chain around it. I've seen people do that. Don't think you can move this suspension, lower it down while you're going to release the tension. There's a lot of built up energy in that spring just sitting there, and it's very dangerous if you just try to let it pop out due to some of the other things that I just said. So always make sure, get the right tool to compress the spring in order to get that out of there. So here's the bracket I was talking about, and then here is the shock stud that goes through the top. Now this doesn't look that rusty, so I'm going to hopefully get lucky and just try to spin this off with the impact gun. A lot of times these nuts rust up, or what happens is they seize themselves onto the shaft, and then they're really hard to get off, and then it also spins an assembly, and you can spin there for hours and hours, you'll never get it out. Now there is a special pair of vice grips that I don't have, but they look similar to these, and what they do is they have a V in them, so it goes nicely around that shaft. Now what I've also done, I just use a normal pair of vice grips, and I've taken a rag and just put it in the center so you don't mar up the shaft, because if you're going to reuse the shock, which I don't know if I'm going to reuse the shock or not, you could have an issue by scoring up the shaft. So let me get the impact and see if I can get that nut off. Hopefully I can. Oh, and that one, that's the easiest one I've ever seen come off, but it looks like that shock has been done before. So let me take this out, and then let me take those three nuts out for that bracket while I got the tool out. Take the bracket out. Now I'll go below and I'll finish taking those nuts out. And the shock will just pull right out. Like so. Okay, so this is the right tool that you're supposed to use to get this spring out. But for whatever reasons, I still don't quite understand. I'm having a lot of problems with the tool. Getting it in there and getting it positioned so I can get the spring out. So you can actually see I got that tool the proper one for the coil spring compressor, it's stuck right in here and I can't get it out. But if I get the spring out, I know I'll be able to get that tool out. So what I ended up doing is grabbing this tool, which is for McPherson struts. Ideally, I would not like to use this. I would prefer to use the other tool, but again, I don't know why it's not working. So what I did not show you, save you a little bit of time with TV magic. So I put this tool on both sides and I tightened it evenly on these nuts, and I compressed the spring enough so I can get it out. And actually it's pretty loose, and what I also ended up doing after I got it up so far is I took the nuts off the opposite side that hold this coil isolator in, and the one side I popped out. So this spring should just be able to come out. So let me try pulling on it a little bit. Still stuck in the top a little bit yet. See if I can pry on it a little more. Almost there. There we go. So one thing I forgot to add is these particular cars, they have a coil spring cover up at the top with the jounce bumper. So I had to take that out in order to gain access to get those spring compressors in there. Now we can look at our isolator, and yeah, that looks pretty beat up. In fact, right here, that's probably where my metal-to-metal contact is coming to, so I'm glad I'm going to replace that. So let me get this out of the way. And I just realized that before I get too carried away, I have a good idea what I need. So I'm going to go ahead and start ordering parts, and hopefully I'll get everything that I need in one shot without... I don't want to take this car too far apart without having some parts to put back together. The car can sit, but I still like to work as I go along. So let me do that, and I'll catch up with you here in a little bit. So it's always a great day when new parts show up, right? So after looking at the suspension, everything that's bad with it, the suspension bushings are cracked, the ball joint boots are cracked and split open, a lot of other different issues, I decided just to go ahead and we're going to rebuild the entire front end. So a couple clicks at rockauto.com and I ordered everything I need for the suspension. So for right now then, I'm going to push all this stuff aside and we got to start removing all the things out of this front end so we can put all these new parts back in. So I think our next step is going to be, we got to get these control arms out of here, so we're going to move that and do that right now. So the next steps I'm going to do to continue with this job is, first I'm going to disconnect and get rid of the sway bar, because I have new bushings that go up into here. Now I did these links last year, don't believe that I filmed it and showed it to you, but basically these were all rusted out and I couldn't get this loose, so what I ended up doing is taking a cutting wheel and I'm slicing in different spots, and then it just all came apart. So this will be real easy, it's new. I'm already just gonna just unscrew it with a ratchet or maybe use an impact, zip it out. Then I'm going to take the nuts out that hold the brackets for the other part of the sway bar that hold it to the frame and just zip that out of there. Next then I'm going to go ahead, I want to disconnect the ball joints from the knuckle. And now these have a cotter pin here, and the easiest way I found, now these don't look too corroded, so I don't think they're going to be that bad. So you have an upper and lower ball joint, and the cotter pin has to come out, and then we're going to loosen up these nuts. So if you take what I call the tail end, like this, and you just spread it out, hopefully they won't be rusty. Sometimes they get rusty, and you actually have to drill out the hole that they go through. I like to take a pair of cutoffs or maybe even channel locks, and then try to grab it and pull on it like this. And try to just walk it off. And that one broke on me. So that one I'm going to have to probably just pop out. Let's see if I can do the top one. This one, for whatever reason, looks newer. Probably because this ball joint's been replaced. So if I pull up on it, pull it kind of straight, this one will just pop out of there. So I'll show you, here's what I meant with this side. So you just kind of take a tool like this and just grab it, and you pull it out like that. Then it's out. So now I go ahead and loosen up the nuts. Most likely I'm not going to be able to get an impact in there. It's just going to be, I'm going to have to wrench it off, and it's a little time consuming, and it's probably the best way to go with this process. Okay, I got both nuts out, so I need to disconnect this ball joint stud from this knuckle, and the best way I found to do that is just take a hammer and hit it on both sides, and it should just pop off. And it's not moving. So I'm going to try to pound here on this shaft. Normally I wouldn't do that, but we're replacing the ball joint anyways, so I really don't care. There we go, like that. A little bit more work, but that's about the only way you found to really do it, besides not having a tool that would push that way down. So I'm going to go ahead and work on the bottom and then take out the upper and lower control arms. So before I pull out the lower control arm, I want to do a couple of things. This here is the strut rod, and this helps locates the bottom of the control arm and keeps it in position. And you have bushings on the end, and I want to change those too. So I have to pull out the cotter pin from there and then take those two nuts out, and then I can take that shaft out. And then where the bolt locates into the frame, that's an alignment position. So I have to make sure that I put that bolt in the exact same position as I take it out. Now obviously when I get all this done, I'm going to take this car to the alignment shop anyways and get a front end alignment, but I want to get everything as close as I can the way it was before. So that's why I have that marked there. I have the other one marked on the other side. So, and I have the driver and passenger side marked so I can put it back in where I took it out. So I'm going to go ahead and take all these nuts out, and I'm going to go ahead and then take the lower control arms out. So I wanted to show you something with the strut rod bushings. When I was taking it apart, I haven't even loosened up the nut that holds everything together yet. This is just the outer nut, and you can see how loose this was because the bushings are shot. So just another good reason why we're going ahead and we're doing all this work. So now the last thing we need to do is we need to take those final two bolts out of the upper control arm that holds it to the shock tower, and then the control arm will come right out and we can start rebuilding it. Now this particular car does not have alignment shims in those two bolts, but depending on the car, when you take that upper control arm out, you might have shims in there. So always make sure that you keep track of them and what position they were in, and if they were front or rear, back or forth, and how thick they were, because those are real critical to get the car back together and get the alignment as close as you can so you can drive it safely to the alignment shop and get it realigned. So I figured out what was wrong with this tool, and that was it was just simply too long, and it was rubbing on the coil support there, and I just couldn't get a good position on it in order for it to work. But on the other side here, I just cut about an inch off with the chop saw, and it's fine now. This one's going to work. So let me show you what this tool is supposed to do while I go ahead and compress it. That works much better. Now it's still, you can see it's rubbing on there, so it's still a little too long, but this will be good enough to get the spring out on this side. I can cut more off later. So after taking all that out, you can see the aftermath. We're not left with too much suspension. Actually, we have no suspension left in this car. So one thing I forgot to add as well is I just disconnected the brake lines, and I just dropped the spindles on each side. Now you can see this one tie rod and the boot, it's split, but I did a check of the tie rod. I just grabbed it when it was in stationary position, when the knuckle was still attached. I moved it up and down. I didn't see any deflection, so I'm not too worried about that. I might see if I could just get some tie rod boots and not have to change the whole tie rod. But so here's what we're left with, all the parts we have. So now we're going to start rebuilding or replacing. So the first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to start rebuilding these upper control arms here. Alright, so looking at all my options, I want to try to keep the car as original as possible, but I also want to look at the costs and weigh the both and see what's the most effective thing to do. So in this case, with the upper control arms, I decided to rebuild them. So I got new ball joints in this new upper control arm shaft kit from Moog, and the ball joints are really simple. Actually, somebody already did these ball joints here, so these are going to be real easy. We're just going to unbolt the nut here, take it out, and put the new ball joint back in. These were some sort of rivet. You'd have to probably cut it to get it out. Some people take a chisel and they pop it out. Or what I like to do is I take a die grinder and I put some slits in here, and then I chip it off like that, either with a chisel or I take an air hammer. I don't like to use the air hammer unless absolutely possible because the noise it makes, I can't stand it, even with earplugs on. So these will be pretty easy. We're just going to unbolt those, hopefully, and then we'll put a new ball joint in. So now then we're going to progress, and I want to work on getting this shaft apart, and then we're going to go ahead and rebuild it. The shaft kit is really nice because you get everything you need. You also get Zerk fittings, so you can put that together when you get it in the car and you'll be able to grease it. Now, I don't know if these are original or not. Obviously, the ball joint isn't, but these actually have little nuts that I already loosened it, like little caps where you could have put a Zerk fitting in there. But back in the day, what they used to do is they used to not use these 90s. They'd actually use straight Zerk fittings, and what happens is you'd see a lot of older cars, they actually have a hole cut in the shock tower so people could go ahead and just go in there and make the grease job easier. Not really a wise thing to do, but sometimes you lift a lot of, you go to a car show or something, you lift at the cars and you look at the engine bays, and if you look at the shock towers, you can actually see that there's holes in there that people cut in there, at some point in the car's life, and that's the reason those holes are there. Now, fortunately, with our car, we don't have any holes, which is good. I don't want to have to go back to seal them back up. So let me go find the socket we need, and then I'm going to start taking these nuts out, and then hopefully we'll get this all apart and put it back together, and then we'll be ready to go. So I had to find my 1 1/4 socket, which I had to really look for. That's pretty big. So let's unbolt these and see what happens. Oh, good. That one came out pretty easy. Let's try the other one. Great. Must say that was too easy. So now I'll go ahead and I'll prep the new shaft, and they give you new bolts too, which is great, and they have these serrations, so they're an interference fit, and they fit down into this hole. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these on the press, and I'm going to get them in, and then we can start rebuilding the upper control arm. Okay, so I pressed the new bolts into the upper control arm shaft, so now I'm ready to start assembling again. Now this kit is nice versus what was on there before, because we've got these little boots that go onto here that hold the grease in place. So before I put this thing together though, I want to put some wheel bearing grease. I want to go ahead and lubricate these threads. And then once we get it back together in the car, we'll use a grease gun, put grease in that Zerk fitting, and then we'll go ahead and lube it all up. But I just want to put a little grease in there, take the initial to take the friction out of it. Like that. So then we have to put these boots on, like I was speaking of, on the ends, and we go ahead and put the control arm in. And this is going to be a little harder to put on because you're going to have some resistance on this one side because of the boot is going to make up the length, but let's push it real hard. There. Now we'll go put these, we can put these ends back in. So I'm going to tighten those down. I'll torque them to spec, and then we'll be all done. We can move on to the ball joint. Okay, so I got these torqued to spec. Now one of the things the service manual tells you is make sure the shaft is about even in the control arm. So what I did is I took a tape measure and just measured from the edge of the stud to this edge part of the control arm, like this. I got a little less than 1.5 inches, a little less than an 1.5 inches here, so I'm pretty confident I have it where it's supposed to be. So now I got to put the Zerk fittings in so we can grease it. And these don't have to be really tight. We're just going to put them in enough so they're a little bit tight, and then we'll angle them so they're pointing outward. Because when it's, remember, this is in the car, we won't be able to get the grease gun in here. So I'm going to turn it. Like so. I might have to angle it a little more once we get it in the car, depending how the arm sits. But the arms, I'm not sure quite where the arm's going to sit, but we should be good there. So if not, we'll just turn it a little bit once it's in the car, and we'll be good to go. Now we're going to move ahead and move into that upper ball joint. Okay, so I moved the control arm around. Now I'm going to ready to go ahead and progress to the ball joint. So, like I was saying earlier, could have been replaced with the one I'm replacing it with already. I just don't know, but it looks very similar. But regardless, then we're just going to go ahead and unloosen these bolts, and we're going to go ahead and pull it out and put the new one in. Now, when we were doing the inspection, I referenced that it looks like you could see the socket. Well, it's really not the case. So the way this ball joint is designed, it's all a sealed unit, but see, it does have the fitting there for a Zerk fitting so we can grease it. So when I showed you that hole and there was nothing there, the Zerk fitting was just missing for whatever reason, and we couldn't grease it. And you see this boot here is really tore, and it's not going to hold grease anyway. So all another good reason to go ahead and change it. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully do these by hand. Just going to loosen them up, and then I'll take it apart, put the new one in. It doesn't look like there's anything wrong with these bolts. I will use the new ones in the kit, but I always save nuts, bolts, and washers. You never know when you're going to need them. Alright, so I got the 4 nuts loose. I'm going to take the ball joint out. And there is no hole for a Zerk fitting. So this is just the brand of the ball joint. I honestly don't like ones that you can't grease yourself. Sometimes it's a sign of a lower quality, even though a lot of the newer cars today, whatever joints they have, they usually don't have Zerk fittings. They're so-called factory greased and good for the lifetime of the vehicle. So then to put the new ball joint in, now you can see our new boot, and this little cap retainer holds the boot in place. So we're just going to line that up there. Put the boot and the cap on, and we'll save the cotter pin and the castle nut for when we put it back together. We'll put that aside. So then I'm just going to go ahead and put these bolts in, tighten it up, and we'll be done. Then the upper ball joint will be all done. So something I discovered when I was going to put the ball joint in, and that was it was much easier to get the Zerk fitting in first and then put the ball joint into the socket in the upper control arm. So that's what I did. I bolted it all together. Normally I like to keep the lock washer and the nut up on the top because these add extra length, and sometimes you might have a clearance issue with something in the bottom of the suspension. But in this case, I noticed that I could not get the grease gun if I had that thickness here, so I turned it around. Once I get it in the car, I'll look at it, make sure it's not going to touch anything down here. Now the last thing I'm going to do, then we'll be all done with this control arm. is I'm going to go ahead and get these new coil spring isolators here. I'm going to put them in the control arm while the control arm's out. It's much easier to do it that way. Go ahead, find the nuts for these, put them on, torque them down, and the upper control arms will be done, and we can move on to the lowers. Something else to do right now before you put this in the car is just to check this, make sure it's got good movement right here in the shaft. Otherwise, you don't want to learn that when you get it in the car, especially when you get it all back together. So I was going to put the upper control arm in, and I noticed that those grease fittings are still really close to the strut tower. So I think I'm going to take the arm out and I'm going to grease them first and then put it back together. I think that's a better way to go, just for whatever reason, if I can't get the grease gun in there. They are still really tight. I actually had to back in those till they bottomed out so I could get that control arm in there, because otherwise they were rubbing a little bit on the shock tower. So then for the lower control arms, I looked at, again, all the options and the costs, and I'm just going to go ahead and replace the entire control arm. For the ease that it is, just to go ahead and do that, because that rubber bushing in the back, this one is really, really difficult to work with, and sometimes I could spend hours just probably trying to get that bushing out. And again, for the cost reasons, it was just more effective just to get a lower control arm than to rebuild this one. Now, this is an OE arm. It's most likely original with the car because it only has 61,000 miles. So I'll still hold on to it. I'm going to be on the lookout at a swap meet. Maybe I can find some NOS parts and I can rebuild that control arm, reuse it one day, or even sell it as an original OE replacement rebuilt with all OE components. So then I'm going to go ahead then. I'm going to put that lower control arm in. So remember, that's the one that mounts up there in that hole. So we have our alignment marks. We already marked where that bolt is because that's our eccentric for our camber and caster adjustment. So we're just going to put that in there, line it up, put the nut on, but we are not going to torque it down yet. We're just going to leave that nut a little loose because we want to torque that specific one when the load is on the suspension. So when we get this all back together, we will go ahead, put a load on the car, and then we're going to torque that bolt to spec. Okay, so I got the upper control arm all bolted in tight. Remember, this one is not dependent on having a load on the suspension, so I just tightened the two bolts. And again, there's no alignment shims, so I just went ahead, put it together, tightened it up. Now what ended up happening is that I tightened up the control arm and those grease fittings were still rubbing on the shock tower. So it shows even more why people used to drill holes in those shock towers, as I was discussing earlier. So I just put the little caps back in that were originally in the old control arms. I'm not going to drive this car really a whole heck of a lot, so I don't see any issues in the short term trying to have to grease those. So I'm not too worried about it. So I also put it in the lower control arm. Remember, that one has a bushing, so we have to tighten that one on the suspension. So it's a little bit loose, so we can go in there later when the load's on the car. We'll tighten it up. So the next thing I got to do then is we got to get this knuckle into the upper and lower control arm ball joints. So I think what I'm going to do is, I just put this up for show purposes. What I'm going to do is put this back down. So I'm going to put the lower part of the knuckle here in this lower ball joint first. I'm going to tighten the nut down. I'm not going to make it super tight. I think I want to do that nut as well when the load on the car. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull the whole unit up, put it into this upper control arm stud, put that nut on, leave it a little bit loose. I'll tighten it again when the load's on the car, and then we'll be all set to go. And we can finish up this job. We can put the springs in, put the shock in, put the load on the car, and tighten it up. So what's going to be helpful in the future to get those cotter pins out is that one of the reasons we were having a problem with them is because they were at a weird angle and they were hard to grip at and get a hold of. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn these holes so they're this way, and by doing that then it's going to give us the least amount of problems in the future. There, so by turning that and making it more straight, you're not gonna be in the way of very many things to try to get that out. I'm gonna do the same thing with the top one. Just gonna turn it straight like that, and that'll be a really good position to get that cotter pin back in. knuckles installed on the upper and lower control arms and everything's all bolted back together. I'm ready to put the springs back in. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and put these new coil insulators that go on the top of the spring onto the spring and then put it into the car. You can see from 50 years old, I'm sure these are original, how just brittle they are. They're just breaking out. There's no soft and pliable rubber like this. So the way these go on is you can see there's a step here where the coil stops, and you can see that here in the coil itself. So I'm just going to pull this off like so, and you can see hopefully even hear how brittle it is. And this is, again, nice soft rubber. I'm going to locate that spot and just walk it onto the spring like so. Like that, and that's ready to go into the car. Okay, so I got the spring back in position. When you get it up in the top area, you have to make sure that the center hole of the spring lines up with this particular area where the sheet metal is stamped down, kind of like a little bracket, so it has to be right in the center. Then also what I did at the bottom then is, remember this edge of this coil spring where it stops goes back into this spring saddle right here and stops at this little piece of sheet metal right here. So now that that's in place, I'm going to go ahead and loosen the tension and watch the spring hopefully goes right back in the position where it's supposed to go. Like so. Perfect. So we're almost ready to reposition the jack stands, moving them under the frame to then under the lower control arm. So we're going to put a load on the car, that way we can torque all the suspension parts that we already put into spec. But before I do that, I got to go ahead and put these strut rods back in. And as mentioned earlier, I'm going to put a new bushing kit. So this kit pretty much goes the way that the old ones came out. The old ones were a little bit difficult to get out. They looked like they had some sort of multiple sleeves that were clamped from the factory. So what I ended up doing is cutting with a die grinder and then popping them off with a screwdriver. So we're going to put this kit in, and then there's the loose strut rod there. We'll bolt that up, and then we won't actually torque down these nuts until we again get the load on the car, and then we'll go ahead and torque those along with everything else. So then what I ended up doing is putting the floor jack under each control arm, jacking it up and taking the weight off the jack stand in the back. So then with the load on the car, I went and tightened up the strut rod nut to tighten up those bushings. I went ahead and tightened the upper and lower control arm nuts, put the cotter pin in place, and then I also got the sway bar links back in. Those just kind of tighten until the rubber flats out a little bit, and then I also went ahead and I tightened up this bolt for the lower control arm, of course, with the load on it, and torqued it to spec. And made sure the alignment points were all in the right spot. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the new shocks in. So here's our new shock here. When you get the shocks, you're going to get a rubber bushing kit for the bottom and then a rubber bushing kit for the top. So with our particular car, we're going to put the rubber bushings on the stud, one on each side. Like so. Remember from when we took it apart, these two go into those holes in the coil spring isolator. So then we'll put the other rubber bushing on the other side, washer, and then we'll tighten it down with a nut. And just like we do with all these types of rubber bushings, we'll just make sure it's compressed a little bit, and then we'll be done. And then with the top kit, we'll put the washer on, put our bushing on, put that bracket that holds the top together that we took off originally. Put the rubber bushing on top, lock washer, put a nut on it, and then we'll be done. So you can see with this bushing, like I was talking about earlier, you just want to, there's really no spec. You just want to tighten it enough just so this starts to mushroom out a little bit, and then the shaft doesn't move, so that's okay, you're good to go. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the other side in, and it looks like front end's really close to being done. I got to put that rubber brake line in and then bleed the brakes. Then we're going to address the other issue that we found last year driving the car around. Okay, now that we got the whole front suspension done and out of the way, we got to turn our attention to the rear suspension. So when I was driving the car around late last year, noticed every time we went over a bump, you heard a good loud thud. So there's something definitely wrong back here too. So I already got the car up in the air. So right now we're going to go crawl under there together and see what's going on. So in the rear here, we have actually much better news, and that is the leaf springs look like they were out recently, and they were either rebuilt or they're newer, and all the bushings and those pads there are all new. The only thing that looks worn are the shocks. So I'm going to go ahead and change the shocks because the fronts were bad anyways and I want to match all four. So I'm going to go ahead and change the rear, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go tighten all the nuts and bolts for the rear suspension and make sure they're torqued properly and to spec. Because I've had components in the suspension in the past where the bolt is loose and the whatever leaf spring control arms just moves and clunks up and down just because it's not tight. So I'm going to go ahead and do that then, take care of all that, and then we should be good to go with our suspension. So to change these rear shocks is actually pretty easy. It's a little easier in the front. So you just have this stud that comes out of the bottom that mounts to that bracket for the leaf spring. You just unbolt it there, and you got to go into the trunk though and unbolt the top, pull the shock out, put the new one in place, and then just tighten those nuts like I showed you in the front, just so they mushroom out a little bit, maybe a little bit tighter, and then you'll be all set, and those will be good to go. And one good way to tell if your shocks are bad, when you have it out, push it in and it should rebound back out, and if it doesn't, it's bad. This is my new shock we're putting in from Monroe. This is the old shock that was in. I have no idea what brand it was or how old it is. So I'm going to push them both in. And you can see the new one here rebounds back and the old one doesn't go anywhere. So both, I tried it with the other shock that came out of there, they both won't rebound, so they're both bad. So another reason again why we're changing them. So the last thing I need to do to call this job finished, before I put the tires back on, I have to grease all the ball joints with the grease gun. Now to do that then, I'm just going to grab the grease gun that I have here and I'm going to put the end on the Zerk fitting. And you've already seen the Zerk fitting, you see me put it on, so I'm not going to bother showing it. I want to instead show you this boot. Now the way that you grease these is that this is an enclosed boot, so you grease them enough just so the boot starts to swell out, and then that's it. That's all the grease you need to put in it. If you put any more grease in that, this boot will split, all the grease will come out, and you're defeating the purpose of the boot, which is to keep dirt, moisture, water, everything else out of that joint. So I'm going to go ahead and insert it and just pump it up. I'm going to give it about 4 or 5 pumps. That was 6. Remember, it's dry, so it's going to take some grease. And it's starting to swell a little bit. And the light just went out on me, so I guess that's all the grease I want to put in here. I'm done. So that wraps up another fantastic show. We got a lot done today. We got the entire front suspension rebuilt, and we changed the shocks in the rear, and also retorqued all the suspension bolts to make sure everything's nice and tight. So I'm off to the alignment shop now. So as always, thanks for watching. Good luck with your projects, and remember, it's not a rewarding day unless you get dirty.